The medieval siege represented warfare at its most methodical and brutal. Unlike the glorified cavalry charges depicted in romantic tales, siege warfare was a grinding affair of patience, engineering, and calculated cruelty. For the common folk trapped within besieged walls, it marked the beginning of a nightmare that could last weeks, months, or even years, a slow-motion catastrophe where hunger often proved deadlier than enemy weapons. By the early Middle Ages, siege warfare had already evolved from ancient practices, though with considerable regional variations. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire had led to a fragmentation of military knowledge, with many sophisticated Roman siege techniques temporarily lost or simplified in Western Europe. Early medieval sieges in this region often amounted to little more than blockades, surrounding a settlement and waiting for hunger to do the work that military technology could not. The Byzantines, however, maintained a more sophisticated approach, preserving much of the Roman siege craft. Their military manual, the Strategicon, attributed to Emperor Maurus, contained detailed instructions for conducting sieges, including the use of mining operations, siege towers, and various artillery pieces. The Eastern Romans employed torsion-powered stone throwers and specialized units of engineers who could undermine walls or construct counter-fortifications. In the Islamic world, siege warfare developed rapidly during the expansionist period of the 7th and 8th centuries. Arab armies initially lacked expertise in taking fortified positions, but quickly adapted techniques from Byzantine and Persian traditions. By the time of the Umayyad Caliphate, Muslim forces were using mangonels, battering rams, and mining operations with considerable skill. The siege of Constantinople in 717–718, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated their growing proficiency. Western European siege methods began to advance significantly during the 11th century, partly due to cross-cultural exchanges during the First Crusade. The Crusaders, confronted with the formidable walls of cities like Antioch and Jerusalem, learned valuable lessons from Byzantine allies and Muslim opponents alike. The Siege of Antioch lasted 8 months and featured the full spectrum of medieval siege tactics: blockade, assault, treachery, and psychological warfare. By the High Middle Ages, the trebuchet had emerged as the supreme siege weapon in both Christian and Islamic arsenals. Unlike the torsion-powered mangonels of earlier periods, trebuchets used a counterweight system that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds with devastating accuracy. During the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1203–1204, Philip II of France deployed trebuchets to systematically reduce Richard the Lionheart's impregnable castle. The siege lasted just 6 months, relatively brief by medieval standards, but demonstrated how improved technology could overcome even the most sophisticated defenses. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century introduced new dimensions to siege warfare. Genghis Khan's armies combined Eastern and Western techniques with ruthless psychological tactics. At the Siege of Nishapur in 1221, the Mongols reportedly used catapults to hurl not just stones, but flaming projectiles, pots of burning naphtha, and even human captives into the city. This psychological terror, combined with their willingness to slaughter entire populations of cities that resisted, often convinced subsequent targets to surrender without a fight. For those trapped inside besieged settlements, the duration of the ordeal was perhaps the most dreaded aspect. Historical records reveal enormous variation in siege length, from brief affairs lasting days to epic struggles spanning years. The Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade dragged on for 2 years, with disease claiming more lives in both the Christian and Muslim camps than actual combat. The defenders of Rouen, besieged by Henry V of England in 1418–1419, endured 5 months of starvation so severe that, according to chroniclers, parents ate their children and the garrison expelled thousands of useless mouths. Non-combatants who were trapped between the city walls and the English lines, left to starve in full view of both sides. These extended sieges created a distinctive psychological environment inside the besieged settlement. The initial weeks might see little hardship, especially if the inhabitants had prepared adequately. Food would be rationed but sufficient. Water supplies, if not contaminated or cut off, would sustain life, and the defenders might maintain high morale, particularly if they expected relief forces. but as weeks stretched into months, conditions invariably deteriorated. The besiegers understood this psychological dimension and exploited it ruthlessly. When Frederick Barbarossa besieged Tortona in 1155, his forces poisoned the city's water supply by throwing in dead horses and human corpses. During the Albigensian Crusade, Simon de Montfort had captured defenders catapulted back into the city of Carcassonne in 1209, a gruesome message to those still resisting. Muslim defenders of Acre in 1191 reportedly hung Christian banners upside down on the walls and publicly beat crosses, knowing this would enrage the Crusaders watching from their siege lines. The display of captives represented another common psychological tactic. During the Siege of Calais, Edward III of England had his men execute prisoners within sight of the city walls, demonstrating the fate that awaited those who continued resistance. Similarly, Ottoman besiegers would often perform executions where defenders could witness them, sometimes with elaborate cruelty designed to break morale. Threatening messages, often delivered by arrow, became another standard feature of siege psychology. Before assaulting a city, besiegers typically offered terms of surrender that grew progressively harsher as the siege continued. Initial offers might be relatively lenient, allowing defenders to march away with their weapons, for instance. As the siege dragged on, terms would worsen until the final, dreaded ultimatum: surrender now or face no mercy when the city falls. This escalating pressure aimed to create divisions within the defending population, with civilians often pushing for surrender while military leaders insisted on holding out. The differences between Eastern and Western approaches to siege warfare, though sometimes overstated, reflected distinctive military traditions and resources. Byzantine sieges typically emphasized technological sophistication and operational patience. Their specialized engineering corps could construct complex siege engines on site, and Byzantine commanders preferred methodical approaches that minimized casualties among their professional soldiers. The 10th century military manual known as the Tactica of Leo VI contains detailed instructions for undermining walls, constructing siege towers of proper height, and coordinating artillery fire, evidence of a systematic approach to siegecraft. Islamic armies, particularly during the Ayyubid and Mamluk periods, excelled at counter-mining operations and the use of incendiary weapons. The defenders of Acre in 1191 employed Greek fire, a petroleum-based incendiary that could burn even on water, against Crusader siege towers. Muslim military engineers also pioneered improvements in trebuchet design, creating machines capable of hurling larger projectiles with greater accuracy than their European counterparts well into the 12th century. Western European approaches to sieges often emphasized direct assault more than their Eastern contemporaries, partly due to the feudal military system's limitations. Feudal levies served for limited periods, making extended sieges problematic for many Western commanders. This time pressure sometimes led to costly frontal assaults that would have been avoided by Byzantine or Islamic armies. The Siege of Lisbon during the Second Crusade saw repeated direct attacks on the walls despite heavy casualties, driven by the Crusaders' awareness that their army might disintegrate if the siege dragged on too long. By the late medieval period, these regional distinctions had diminished somewhat through cross-cultural exchange and the emergence of professional standing armies in Europe. The introduction of gunpowder artillery in the 14th century gradually transformed siege warfare across all regions. Early cannon were unreliable and dangerous to their operators, but by the mid-15th century, they had become the dominant siege weapons. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 demonstrated the new reality. Sultan Mehmed II's massive bombards, some capable of firing stone balls weighing over 600 pounds, systematically reduced the 1,000-year-old walls that had repelled countless earlier sieges. For inhabitants of a besieged settlement, the appearance of cannon outside their walls represented a fundamental shift in the siege equation. Traditional defenses, high, relatively thin walls designed to prevent scaling, became vulnerabilities in the age of gunpowder, as they presented perfect targets for artillery. Communities that had relied on their medieval fortifications for centuries suddenly found themselves exposed to a revolutionary technology that rendered their security obsolete. The final decades of the medieval period saw a transitional phase in siege warfare, with gunpowder weapons supplementing rather than replacing traditional methods. At the Siege of Rhodes in 1480, Ottoman forces combined massive bombards with mining operations, trebuchets, and attempts to fill the defensive ditches, a comprehensive approach that nearly succeeded against the Knights Hospitaller. The defenders, for their part, conducted counter-mining operations, sortied against Ottoman artillery positions, and employed their own cannon against the besiegers. Throughout these evolutions in siege warfare, the fundamental experience for those trapped inside remained grim. As food supplies dwindled, strict rationing systems emerged, typically privileging fighting men over civilians. Water became precious when wells ran dry or became contaminated. Disease spread rapidly in crowded conditions with deteriorating sanitation. The psychological pressure mounted as inhabitants watched their children grow gaunt with hunger, listened to the constant work of enemy sappers beneath the walls, and witnessed the gradual destruction of their homes by artillery fire or incendiary projectiles. For medieval urban dwellers, the approach of an enemy army set in motion a frantic preparation period that could determine survival. Authorities would take inventory of food stores, expel useless mouths, if possible, strengthen defenses, and perhaps destroy suburbs outside the walls that could provide cover for attackers. Once the siege began in earnest, a grim waiting game ensued, a war of resources, will, and nerve that would test the social fabric of the community to its breaking point. As the initial shock of being besieged subsided, the most immediate concern for those trapped within city walls quickly became apparent: feeding the population. While medieval urban centers typically maintained granaries and food reserves, few were prepared for the extended isolation that siege warfare imposed. The systematic management and eventual depletion of food supplies became the central drama of besieged life, creating a slow-motion catastrophe that transformed social relations and pushed human endurance to its limits. Municipal authorities typically implemented rationing systems within days of a siege's commencement. These systems varied considerably based on local governance structures, but most followed similar principles of triage and prioritization. In the early stages, authorities would conduct comprehensive inventories of all food stores, often requisitioning private supplies for communal distribution. During the 1429 Siege of Orleans, French records show that city officials cataloged not only obvious foodstuffs like grain and salt meat, but also counted livestock within the walls, seed stores intended for the next planting, and even brewers' grain reserves. The distribution hierarchies established during sieges reflected both military necessity and existing social structures. Fighting men invariably received priority, with defenders on the walls allocated the largest portions. During the 1462 Siege of Lancastrian held Bamberg Castle, the garrison received daily bread rations of approximately 1 pound per man, while non-combatants made do with half that amount or less. This military prioritization made strategic sense. Starving defenders couldn't hold the walls, but created immediate tensions between military and civilian populations. Within the civilian population, existing social hierarchies typically determined access to food. During the 1084 Siege of Rome by Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, contemporary accounts describe how nobles continued to receive meat rations long after such protein had disappeared from common citizens' diets. In the 1453 Ottoman Siege of Constantinople, the Byzantine aristocracy maintained private food caches even as the general population subsisted on increasingly meager public distributions. This inequality often sparked internal conflicts that compounded the external threat, with food riots documented during numerous prolonged sieges. The nutritional deterioration experienced by besieged populations followed predictable patterns. In the initial weeks, diets became monotonous but remained calorically adequate. Luxury foods disappeared first: fresh fruits, certain meats, and imported goods like spices or wine. During the 1218-1219 Siege of Damietta in Egypt, Crusader chronicles note that sugar and preserved fruits vanished from markets within the first month, while bread remained available, if increasingly expensive. As sieges progressed into their second and third months, protein sources typically became scarce. Authorities would slaughter draft animals no longer needed for transport, as occurred during the 1244 siege of Montségur, where the besieged Cathars killed and consumed their horses by the siege's third month. Meat rations would shrink and eventually disappear for all but the most privileged or essential personnel. The protein deficiency that followed led to muscle wasting, decreased immunity, and particular danger for pregnant women and growing children. The most insidious nutritional threats came from vitamin deficiencies that developed over extended sieges. Scurvy, resulting from vitamin C deficiency, appeared frequently in winter sieges when fresh produce was unavailable. During the 1303-1304 Scottish siege of Stirling Castle, English defenders developed bleeding gums, loosening teeth, and reopening of old wounds, classic scurvy symptoms, after approximately 4 months. Vitamin A deficiency led to night blindness among defenders, a particularly dangerous condition for sentries. During the 1268 siege of Antioch, Mamluk attackers reportedly timed night assaults to exploit this known weakness among the Christian defenders, who had subsisted on grain-only diets for months. As sieges extended beyond 6 months, truly desperate food situations emerged. Medieval accounts document consumption of increasingly unpalatable and potentially dangerous food sources. During the 1127-1128 siege of Nuremberg, chroniclers reported that defenders ate rats, mice, and eventually shoe leather boiled to soften it. The 1315-1316 Scottish siege of Carlisle Castle forced English defenders to consume not only horses and dogs, but also, according to contemporary accounts, cats, rats, and boiled leather from shields and saddles. Perhaps most notoriously, extended sieges occasionally drove populations to cannibalism. While some accounts may be exaggerated for propaganda purposes, enough consistent documentation exists to confirm this practice in extreme circumstances. During the First Crusade's 1098 siege of Marra in Syria, multiple independent chronicles record that starving crusaders consumed the bodies of dead Muslims. Raymond of Aguilers, an eyewitness, wrote disturbingly that the Christians cooked pagan adults in cooking pots, impaled children on spits, and devoured them grilled. While possibly embellished, the core fact of cannibalism appears in too many independent accounts to dismiss. Similarly, during the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346-1347, defenders reportedly resorted to cannibalism after all animals, leather, and vegetation had been consumed. The 1315-1317 Great Famine exacerbated several siege situations in Scotland and northern England, with accounts from the siege of Berwick describing parents consuming dead children, though such claims must be treated with appropriate historical skepticism. The mechanics of food distribution during sieges created complex logistical challenges. Many cities established central distribution points, often in market squares or near churches, where citizens would queue for their rations. During the 1304 siege of Stirling, rations were distributed after morning mass, with recipients bringing wooden tallies to track their allocations. In Muslim-controlled cities like Damascus during the 1148 Second Crusade siege, distribution often occurred after Friday prayers, with the mosque serving as both spiritual center and rationing headquarters. Record-keeping became essential to prevent fraud, though systems varied in sophistication. Byzantine cities typically maintained detailed registers of inhabitants, allowing for relatively organized rationing. During Constantinople's final siege in 1453, district administrators maintained lists of households and their members, with rations distributed accordingly. Western European cities often used simpler systems of tokens or tallies. During the 1464-1465 siege of Harlech Castle in Wales, defenders used a notch system on wooden sticks to track bread distributions. As food became scarcer, black markets inevitably emerged. These unofficial economies reflected both the desperation of the hungry and the opportunity for profit. During the 1429-1430 siege of Thessalonica by the Ottomans, Byzantine records mention price gouging for basic foods, with wheat selling for 10 times its pre-siege value by the 4th month. The wealthy could often maintain adequate nutrition long after public rations became starvation portions, creating visible disparities that undermined community solidarity. Food hoarding represented another common response to siege conditions. Wealthy households typically began stockpiling supplies at the first rumor of approaching enemies. During the 1462 siege of Barcelona, municipal authorities conducted house-to-house searches after discovering that certain noble families had concealed substantial grain stores while claiming public rations. The 1171 siege of Dublin by native Irish forces revealed similar patterns, with Norse-Irish merchants caught hiding salted fish and grain in false bottom storage containers. Municipal authorities attempted to combat hoarding through increasingly draconian measures as sieges progressed. Penalties for concealing food could be severe. During the 1183 siege of Acre, Saladin's administrators reportedly executed 2 merchants found hoarding grain. In European cities, punishment more typically involved confiscation and public shaming. Records from the 1173 siege of Rouen indicate that hoarders were placed in stocks with samples of their hidden food displayed around their necks. The social psychology of food scarcity created distinctive behavioral patterns in besieged populations. Early-stage cooperation often gave way to increasing suspicion and competition as resources dwindled. During the 1421 Hussite siege of Karlstegen Castle in Bohemia, initial communal cooking arrangements broke down after 3 months, with small groups forming to protect their dwindling supplies from others. The siege of Weinsberg in 1140 saw the population initially sharing resources freely, but by its conclusion, contemporary accounts describe neighbors accusing each other of hoarding and theft. Certain sieges became notorious specifically for their food-related horrors. The 1144 siege of Edessa by Zengi's forces created such desperate food shortages that, according to Michael the Syrian's chronicle, mothers ate their children and men devoured their fellows. While potentially exaggerated, the account reflects the psychological impact of starvation on contemporary observers. The 1584-1585 siege of Antwerp during the Dutch Revolt saw inhabitants reduced to grinding dried fish bones into flour for bread after grain supplies were exhausted. Religious communities sometimes implemented distinctive approaches to food shortages. Monasteries and convents, with their traditions of communal living and disciplined consumption, occasionally managed resources more effectively than secular communities. During the 1487-1488 siege of Malaga by Castilian forces, the Dominican monastery maintained strict equal rationing among its members long after the wider city had descended into inequitable distribution. Similarly, during the 1453 siege of Constantinople, the Pantocrator monastery implemented a rotating fasting system that reduced overall consumption while maintaining minimum nutrition for all members. The psychological impact of hunger created distinctive cognitive effects in besieged populations. Medical chronicles from the 1289-1291 siege of Acre describe defenders becoming increasingly irrational and prone to mood swings as malnutrition progressed. During the 1462 siege of Barcelona, municipal records note increasing difficulty in reaching collective decisions in city council meetings, with debates becoming more acrimonious and less focused as hunger affected cognitive function. Children suffered disproportionately in siege conditions. Their growing bodies required more nutrients per pound of body weight than adults, making them especially vulnerable to malnutrition. Growth stunting became common in extended sieges, with skeletal evidence from mass graves following the 1453 fall of Constantinople showing arrested development in child remains. During the 1210 Albigensian Crusade siege of Minerve, chroniclers noted that children became listless and unresponsive after months of inadequate nutrition, with many too weak to flee when the castle finally fell. The end of food supplies often determined a siege's conclusion more decisively than military action. When the Byzantine city of Thessalonica surrendered to Ottoman forces in 1430 after a year-long siege, the capitulation came not from a breach in the walls, but from the city's complete exhaustion of food supplies. Similarly, the English garrison at Rouen in 1449 surrendered to French forces after determining they had exactly 3 days of minimal rations remaining, choosing negotiated terms over the final stages of starvation. The experience of hunger created lasting trauma in medieval populations. Chronicles written years after sieges often focus obsessively on food details, suggesting the psychological scars left by prolonged deprivation. Survivors of the 1204 siege of Constantinople described food dreams decades later, and civic records from post-siege recoveries frequently show communities investing heavily in expanded granaries and food storage systems, preparing for threats that might not materialize for generations. As food supplies dwindled within besieged settlements, another equally lethal threat emerged from the deteriorating conditions: the collapse of public health systems. Medieval cities, even in peacetime, balanced precariously on the edge of sanitary disaster. Most urban centers had developed rudimentary infrastructure to manage human waste, garbage disposal, and water supply, systems that functioned adequately under normal circumstances but rapidly failed under siege conditions. The breakdown typically began with water contamination. Medieval cities sourced water through a combination of wells, cisterns, aqueducts, and natural waterways. During sieges, external water sources were among the first targets for attacking forces. When Frederick Barbarossa besieged Milan in 1162, his engineers systematically destroyed the irrigation canals and aqueducts supplying the city. Similarly, Ottoman forces targeting Constantinople in 1453 cut the external aqueducts within the first week, forcing the population to rely solely on cisterns and wells within the walls. These internal water sources became increasingly problematic as sieges progressed. Wells often ran dry from overuse or became contaminated as waste disposal systems failed. During the 1210 siege of Minerve, defenders were reduced to collecting mourning dew from walls and rooftops after their single spring dried up in the summer heat. At Rochester Castle in 1215, King John's forces diverted the River Medway away from the fortress, leaving the garrison dependent on a single well that they reportedly had to ration to just a cupful per man each day. Cisterns, while more resilient than wells, presented their own problems during extended sieges. Standing water became breeding grounds for mosquitoes, particularly in Mediterranean regions. During the 1480 Rhodes siege, knights recorded increasing cases of malarial fever as defenders were forced to drink from increasingly stagnant cistern water. More immediately dangerous was the contamination of water supplies by human and animal waste when normal disposal systems became overwhelmed. Medieval cities typically managed human waste through a combination of cesspits, rudimentary sewers, and organized collection for agricultural use outside the walls. Under siege conditions, this system broke down rapidly. Cesspits filled beyond capacity, sewers backed up without flowing water to clear them, and the regular removal of waste to fields outside became impossible. During the 1388 siege of Durham, records indicate that within 2 months, all designated waste areas were overflowing, forcing inhabitants to create improvised dumping grounds in gardens and abandoned buildings. The disposal of animal carcasses created additional sanitation challenges. As draft animals were slaughtered for food, their inedible remains required disposal. During Saladin's 1187 siege of Jerusalem, chroniclers described the growing problem of animal bones and entrails piling up in streets as the normal removal systems failed. In the 1428 English siege of Orleans, French accounts mention the difficulty of disposing of horse remains after consumption, with defenders eventually pushing carcasses over the walls at night, a practice that provided the besiegers with evidence of deteriorating conditions within. The combination of contaminated water, improper waste disposal, and increasingly crowded living conditions, as populations concentrated in safer areas of besieged settlements, created ideal circumstances for epidemic disease. Dysentery, known colloquially as the bloody flux, emerged as the most common and immediately devastating illness in siege conditions. The infection, causing severe diarrhea, abdominal pain, and dehydration, spread rapidly through water contaminated with fecal matter. During the 1346-1347 siege of Calais, English chroniclers recorded that dysentery killed more defenders than combat, with estimates suggesting that up to 20% of the French garrison succumbed to the disease before surrender. The 1302-1303 Mamluk siege of Crac des Chevaliers saw similar patterns, with Templar records indicating that dysentery had rendered nearly half the garrison unfit for duty by the siege's conclusion. The disease proved particularly deadly when combined with the malnutrition typical of extended sieges, as weakened bodies lacked the resources to fight infection. Typhus represented another common siege killer, particularly in cooler climates. Spread by body lice that thrived in the unwashed, crowded conditions of besieged populations, typhus caused high fever, distinctive rashes, and often delirium. During the 1464-1465 siege of Harlech Castle in Wales, contemporary accounts describe defenders suffering from burning fevers with spots that matched typhus symptoms. The disease proved especially problematic during winter sieges, when bathing and changing clothes became less frequent due to fuel shortages for heating water. Respiratory infections flourished in the crowded conditions of besieged settlements. As populations concentrated in central areas away from threatened walls or bombardment, living spaces became dangerously overcrowded. During the 1453 Constantinople siege, thousands of rural refugees had flooded into the city before the Ottoman encirclement, forcing multiple families to share spaces designed for single households. Byzantine accounts describe coughing sickness spreading rapidly through these crowded quarters, likely referring to influenza or tuberculosis accelerated by close contact. The plague, while less common than other siege diseases due to its dependence on rat populations and their fleas, occasionally added its devastation to already dire circumstances. During the 1347 siege of Kaffa by Mongol forces, the besiegers themselves were struck by plague, leading to the famous account of corpses being catapulted into the city, an early example of biological warfare. The defenders subsequently contracted the disease, with Gabriel de Mussy's account describing how one sick man could infect the entire city. The resulting epidemic contributed significantly to Kaffa's eventual surrender. Medieval medical practitioners faced nearly impossible challenges when treating siege-related illnesses. Working with limited supplies, medieval physicians relied heavily on Galenic theories of humoral balance, often prescribing purging and bloodletting that further weakened already compromised patients. During the 1249 siege of Damietta in Egypt, Crusader medical records describe treating dysentery with bloodletting and wine mixed with ground deer antler, interventions that likely hastened patients' decline rather than aiding recovery. The shortage of medical supplies during sieges forced practitioners to improvise with locally available materials. During the 1138 siege of Weinsberg, German accounts describe defenders using cobwebs to dress wounds when proper bandages ran out. At Rhodes in 1480, the Knights Hospitaller, renowned for their medical knowledge, resorted to distilling alcohol from dried fruit to disinfect wounds when their medicinal supplies dwindled. These improvisations occasionally produced effective treatments through trial and error, but more often provided little benefit beyond psychological comfort. Medical personnel themselves often became casualties of the diseases they treated. During the 1464 siege of Kikini in Greece, Venetian records note that 3 of the fortress's 4 physicians died of the same camp fever, afflicting their patients. This loss of medical expertise midway through sieges created cascading healthcare failures, with trained physicians replaced by apprentices or individuals with only rudimentary first aid knowledge. Religious institutions often stepped into healthcare gaps when secular systems failed. Monasteries and convents, with their traditions of caring for the sick, frequently converted their facilities into improvised hospitals during sieges. During the 1238 siege of Valencia, Franciscan friars converted their entire monastery into a treatment center for dysentery patients. Similarly, during the 1453 Constantinople siege, the Pantocrator Monastery, which operated a hospital in peacetime, expanded its capacity by setting up beds in corridors and the central courtyard. The psychological impact of witnessing widespread disease created distinctive patterns of behavior in besieged populations. Fear of contagion often led to the isolation and abandonment of the sick, particularly those suffering from visible conditions like plague buboes or typhus rashes. During the 1290–1291 Siege of Acre, Templar records describe dedicated death houses, where those with suspected plague were sent, often with minimal care provided. This isolation, while understandable as an attempt at disease control, frequently condemned treatable patients to death from neglect. Conversely, some siege accounts describe extraordinary care provided to the ill despite dangerous conditions. During the 1429 Siege of Orleans, records mention local women who volunteered to nurse dysentery patients despite the obvious contagion risks. At Maastricht in 1579, during the Dutch Revolt, municipal records praise a group of Dominican nuns who remained with plague victims even after the city physician had abandoned them. These examples of compassion amid crisis represent important counterpoints to the broader pattern of public health collapse. The psychological toll of extended sieges manifested in conditions recognizable to modern observers as anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress. Contemporary accounts describe defenders experiencing siege melancholy, a state of lethargy, hopelessness, and emotional numbness that impaired both military readiness and social functioning. During the 1462 Siege of Barcelona, municipal records note increasing cases of despair sickness among defenders, with symptoms including inability to sleep, loss of appetite, and uncontrollable weeping. Sleep disorders became particularly common, with the constant vigilance required by siege conditions combining with psychological stress to create chronic insomnia. During the 1204 Siege of Constantinople, Byzantine accounts describe defenders becoming like walking ghosts after weeks of interrupted sleep from bombardment and assault alerts. This sleep deprivation further compromised immune systems already weakened by malnutrition, creating greater vulnerability to infectious disease. Suicide rates increased markedly during prolonged sieges, particularly after hope of relief forces had faded. During the 1453 Constantinople siege, multiple accounts describe defenders throwing themselves from the walls rather than face capture after the Ottoman breakthrough. At Weinsberg in 1140, chroniclers recorded that several defenders hanged themselves as food supplies approached exhaustion. These actions reflected not just fear of enemy treatment, but the cumulative psychological damage inflicted by extended siege conditions. Children displayed particular psychological vulnerability to siege conditions. Medieval accounts frequently mention children becoming mute or unresponsive after witnessing violence or experiencing prolonged deprivation. During the 1487 Siege of Malaga, Castilian chronicles describe captured Muslim children as silent as stones, unable or unwilling to speak after months of bombardment and starvation. Modern understanding of childhood trauma suggests these were likely cases of what we now recognize as selective mutism, or dissociative disorders resulting from extreme stress. Religious interpretations of disease often shaped both medical responses and psychological coping mechanisms. Many besieged populations viewed epidemic disease as divine punishment, leading to increased religious observances even as physical conditions deteriorated. During the 1315–1316 Siege of Carlisle, English defenders organized daily processions around the castle walls carrying religious relics, seeking divine intervention against both human enemies and the dysentery ravaging their ranks. These religious responses, while providing psychological comfort, sometimes diverted energy and resources from more effective sanitary interventions. The combination of disease, psychological stress, and malnutrition created synergistic effects that accelerated population decline in besieged settlements. Malnutrition compromised immune responses, making disease more deadly. Disease increased metabolic demands that malnutrition made impossible to meet, and psychological stress impaired both immune function and rational decision-making regarding hygiene and resource allocation. This devastating cycle explains why many sieges ended not with dramatic military actions, but with the quiet surrender of populations too weakened by illness and hunger to continue resistance. As disease and hunger weakened the physical resilience of besieged populations, the social fabric binding medieval communities began to fray, and in many cases, tear apart completely. The extraordinary pressures of siege warfare did not affect all inhabitants equally, exposing and exacerbating existing social divisions, while creating new fault lines within formerly cohesive communities. Medieval urban centers operated according to well-established hierarchies in peacetime. The nobility and wealthy merchants occupied the upper echelons, followed by guild masters and skilled artisans, with unskilled laborers, servants, and the poor forming the lowest strata. This social stratification, accepted as natural and divinely ordained during normal times, became increasingly contentious as siege conditions worsened and resources dwindled. In the early stages of sieges, social hierarchies often strengthened as communities rallied around established leadership. During the first weeks of the 1429 Orleans siege, accounts describe how Duke Charles of Orleans' representatives successfully organized defense efforts with broad public support. Similarly, when Emperor Frederick Barbarossa besieged Milan in 1158, the initial response showed remarkable unity across social classes, with aristocrats and commoners working side by side to strengthen defenses. This early cohesion typically began to dissolve as sieges extended beyond their first month. The inequality in resource distribution became increasingly visible and contentious. During the 1216 siege of Dover Castle, contemporary accounts describe how the garrison commander, Hubert de Burgh, continued to enjoy wine and fresh bread, while common soldiers subsisted on increasingly meager rations of pea flour and water. At Constantinople in 1453, Byzantine nobles reportedly maintained private food stores even as commoners starved in the streets. Housing arrangements during sieges reinforced these divisions. Wealthy families often retreated to stone structures in city centers, areas less vulnerable to bombardment and fire. During the 1428 siege of Orleans, municipal records show that elite families occupied the central quarter near the cathedral, the area least exposed to English artillery. Meanwhile, poorer residents remained in wooden structures near the walls, where they faced greater physical danger and were more frequently called upon for repair work after bombardments. The most dramatic manifestation of class division during sieges emerged in the treatment of useless mouths, those deemed non-essential to defense. This callous but pragmatic calculation targeted the elderly, infirm, very young, and poor without specialized skills. During the 1346-1347 siege of Calais, the French commander eventually expelled approximately 500 non-combatants, hoping to conserve food supplies for fighting men. Edward III initially prevented these civilians from passing through English lines, forcing them to starve in the no-man's land between besiegers and defenders, though accounts suggest he eventually relented and allowed them passage after several days. This practice appeared consistently across medieval Europe. During the 1183 siege of Acre, Saladin's forces allowed Christian non-combatants to leave the city, calculating that their departure would extend the siege by depleting food supplies more slowly. More brutally, at the 1415-1416 siege of Harfleur, English accounts record the French garrison driving out all manner of feeble folk, women and children, who were trapped between the walls and the English lines until Henry V permitted them passage. The decision-making process regarding these expulsions created intense internal conflicts. Municipal records from the 1474 siege of Neuss show heated debates among city councilors about which categories of inhabitants should be expelled. Some argued for removing all women and children. Others insisted that women were essential for nursing the wounded and preparing food. Still others suggested expelling the elderly regardless of wealth or status. These debates exposed underlying tensions about whose lives were considered more valuable to the community. Religious institutions played complex and sometimes contradictory roles during siege-induced social crises. In many cases, monasteries, convents, and church properties became centers for charitable relief. During the 1429 Orleans siege, the Augustinian monastery distributed bread to the poor from its private grain stores. Similarly, during the 1238 siege of Valencia, Islamic accounts praised the city's main mosque for converting its courtyard into a soup kitchen serving the poorest residents. However, religious institutions sometimes hoarded resources while preaching sacrifice to the general population. During the 1204 siege of Constantinople, certain Orthodox monasteries reportedly maintained substantial food reserves, while the Patriarch called for communal fasting. In the 1487 siege of Malaga, Castilian accounts claim that the city's main mosque kept oil and grain stores hidden, while ordinary citizens starved. These contradictions between religious teaching and institutional practice created profound disillusionment among besieged populations. The clergy themselves faced difficult choices between self-preservation and Christian charity. During the 1415 siege of Harfleur, parish priests reportedly debated whether church grain stores should be reserved for the spiritual well-being of the community or distributed to the starving. Different religious communities reached different conclusions, creating inconsistent practices even within single besieged settlements. Economic divisions widened dramatically as siege markets evolved. While official rationing systems attempted to ensure minimum sustenance for all inhabitants, parallel black markets inevitably emerged where the wealthy could supplement their allocations. During the 1453 Constantinople siege, Byzantine accounts describe how a single egg could cost a week's wages for a laborer by the siege's third month. At Antioch in 1098, Crusader chronicles mention that knights sold their weapons and armor piece by piece to purchase food from merchants who had hoarded supplies. These economic disparities frequently sparked civil unrest within besieged settlements. Food riots became common features of extended sieges, with hungry populations targeting both government storehouses and private caches. During the 1173 siege of Rouen, chroniclers describe a mob breaking into the archbishop's granary after rumors spread that he maintained ample supplies while publicly advocating stricter rationing. Similarly, during the 1464-1465 siege of Harlech Castle, Welsh accounts mention 3 separate riots targeting suspected hoarders among the garrison's officers. More organized forms of resistance also emerged. The 1449 siege of Rouen saw the formation of a People's Committee that demanded representation in rationing decisions previously made exclusively by military commanders and nobles. During the 1462 siege of Barcelona, craft guild representatives forced their way into the city council, insisting on oversight of food distribution that they claimed favored elite families. These movements represented not just reactions to immediate hardship, but challenges to fundamental social hierarchies. Military authorities typically responded harshly to such unrest, recognizing that internal division threatened defensive capabilities more than enemy action. During the 1429 Orleans siege, the French commander ordered 2 men hanged for inciting a riot over bread distribution. At Rhodes in 1480, the Knights Hospitaller executed several Greek civilians who had organized protests against the preferential treatment given to Latin Christians in food allocation. These severe responses reflected the existential threat that social breakdown posed to besieged communities. The psychological dimensions of class conflict during sieges created lasting social trauma. Lower-class inhabitants who witnessed elite families maintaining relatively comfortable conditions while they suffered developed deep resentment that persisted long after sieges concluded. Records from post-siege Calais show that returning inhabitants refused to reoccupy properties near those owned by merchants who had hoarded food during the siege. Similarly, after the 1462 Barcelona siege, guild records document ongoing boycotts of businesses owned by families perceived to have received preferential treatment. Mutinies among defending forces represented another manifestation of social breakdown. Military hierarchies, like their civilian counterparts, came under increasing strain as conditions deteriorated. During the 1268 siege of Antioch, Byzantine sources describe how common soldiers eventually refused orders to conduct sorties, believing that their commanders were preserving their own strength with larger rations while sending hungry men to die. The 1464 siege of Caccini saw a partial mutiny when Italian mercenaries discovered that Greek officers received wine rations while they received only water. Women's roles often transformed dramatically during sieges, sometimes challenging established gender hierarchies. With men focused on defense, women frequently assumed management of food distribution, care for the wounded, and maintenance of remaining civic functions. During the 1472 Siege of Beauvais, contemporary accounts credit the town's successful defense partly to women who organized water brigades, transported ammunition, and even participated directly in repelling assaults. The 1429 Orleans siege similarly saw women taking increasingly public roles in organizing civilian resources. This expansion of women's responsibilities created social tensions that persisted after sieges concluded. Records from post-siege Beauvais show male guild members attempting to reclaim exclusive control over certain economic activities that women had successfully managed during the crisis. Similarly, after the 1480 Rhodes siege, the Knights Hospitaller issued ordinances specifically restricting women to appropriate feminine occupations, suggesting that siege conditions had disrupted gender norms in ways the authorities found troubling. Children experienced particularly severe dislocation during siege-induced social breakdown. As family units fractured under extreme stress, orphaned or abandoned children formed groups for mutual protection and food acquisition. During the 1204 Constantinople siege, Byzantine accounts describe bands of children scavenging through abandoned houses and stealing from market stalls. At Antioch in 1098, Crusader chronicles mention wild children who lived in the ruins of buildings destroyed by bombardment, surviving through begging and theft. Authorities responded to these child groups with a mixture of charity and punishment that reflected their ambivalent status. During the 1487 Malaga siege, Castilian records mention both soup kitchens established specifically for orphaned children and punitive measures against child thieves caught stealing from official storehouses. This contradictory approach demonstrated the breakdown of normal social integration mechanisms under siege conditions. The most extreme manifestation of social breakdown appeared in documented cases of abandonment and betrayal within families. During the 1315-1316 Carlisle siege, English accounts claim that some parents abandoned weaker children to preserve food for those with better survival prospects. At Jerusalem in 1099, Crusader chronicles describe families drawing lots to determine which member would be sacrificed if cannibalism became necessary, though such accounts may reflect propagandistic exaggeration rather than widespread practice. The aftermath of sieges revealed the deep social fractures created by these experiences. Communities that had endured extended sieges often struggled to reestablish functional hierarchies and relationships. Records from post-siege Calais show property disputes, recriminations over siege-time behaviors, and resistance to returning authorities. Similarly, after the 1462 Barcelona siege, guild documents reveal ongoing conflicts about which families deserved compensation for their siege contributions, and which had failed the community through hoarding or collaboration. These post-siege tensions sometimes resulted in formal changes to governance structures. Following the 1173 Rouen siege, the city charter was modified to include guild representation in emergency food management decisions. After the 1428-1429 Orleans siege, the city established a permanent citizens' committee with oversight of the municipal granaries, institutionalizing lessons learned from the class conflicts that had emerged during the crisis. The experience of siege warfare thus served not only as a military challenge, but as a stress test for medieval social structures. Communities with more flexible and inclusive governance often weathered these crises more effectively than rigidly hierarchical societies. The Siege of Orleans in 1429 saw relatively limited civil unrest compared to contemporary sieges, partly because city authorities incorporated guild representatives into decision-making processes from the early stages. By contrast, the catastrophic social breakdown during Constantinople's final siege in 1453 reflected the Byzantine Empire's increasingly ossified class structure, which proved unable to adapt to extreme circumstances. The thunderous impact of a 300-pound stone projectile could collapse an entire section of wall, crushing defenders beneath tons of rubble. For besieged urban dwellers, the technological innovations of medieval siege engines represented a terrifying evolution in warfare that transformed their homes into death traps. While starvation and disease worked slowly to undermine resistance, the physical bombardment of cities created immediate, catastrophic destruction that no medieval urban center was originally designed to withstand. The trebuchet emerged as the most devastating siege weapon of the High Middle Ages, reaching its technological peak in the 13th century. Unlike earlier torsion-powered catapults, trebuchets operated on a counterweight system that could launch projectiles weighing between 100 and 300 pounds with remarkable accuracy. When Edward I besieged Stirling Castle in 1304, his massive trebuchet Warwolf hurled stones that reportedly weighed over 300 pounds and required 50 men to operate. Scottish chronicles describe how a single hit from this weapon could bring down an entire tower, creating psychological terror among defenders who watched massive stones arc slowly through the sky before devastating impact. The engineering sophistication of trebuchets advanced considerably through cross-cultural exchange during the Crusades. Muslim engineers pioneered the development of counterweight systems that replaced the earlier, less efficient traction trebuchets powered by teams of men pulling ropes. During the 1191 Siege of Acre, Richard the Lionheart's forces employed counterweight trebuchets that could maintain a steady bombardment with minimal crew fatigue. Contemporary accounts describe stones falling like rain upon the city, with defenders forced to abandon entire sections of wall that came under sustained fire. The psychological impact of trebuchet bombardment proved nearly as damaging as the physical destruction. The distinctive creaking sound of the throwing arm, followed by the whistling of projectiles through the air, created a form of acoustic warfare that prevented defenders from sleeping and maintained constant anxiety. During the 1210 Siege of Minerve, Albigensian defenders reportedly became so psychologically broken by the continuous bombardment that many exhibited symptoms of what modern clinicians would recognize as acute stress disorder, including dissociative states and extreme startle responses. Trebuchet crews developed specialized techniques to maximize psychological impact. Bombardment often intensified at night, when the darkness amplified the terror of unseen projectiles. During the 1304 Siege of Stirling, Edward I ordered nocturnal bombardment specifically to prevent defenders from sleeping. Similarly, at the 1249 Siege of Damietta, Sultan Ayyub's engineers synchronized multiple trebuchets to fire simultaneously, creating thunderous impacts that reverberated throughout the city and magnified the sense of impending doom among defenders. While trebuchets excelled at destroying walls and structures, the mangonel and catapult offered greater rate of fire and mobility, making them ideal for targeting defenders on walls or suppressing specific sections during assaults. These torsion-powered weapons used twisted ropes or sinews to generate propulsive force, hurling smaller projectiles with greater frequency than trebuchets. During the 1216 Siege of Dover Castle, French forces deployed at least 8 mangonels to maintain continuous fire against English defenders attempting to repair damaged sections of wall. The ballista, essentially a massive crossbow, provided besiegers with precision capability against individual targets. These weapons could fire large bolts or darts with enough force to penetrate multiple armored defenders standing in line. During the 1138 Siege of Weinsberg, Imperial forces reportedly used ballistae to target specific defenders known to be commanding sections of the wall, effectively decapitating the defensive leadership. The psychological impact of seeing comrades precisely targeted and killed created significant demoralization among remaining defenders. The projectiles themselves evolved beyond simple stones to maximize both physical and psychological damage. Fire pots, clay containers filled with flammable mixtures, became standard ammunition for siege engines by the 12th century. During the 1203 Siege of Constantinople, Crusader forces launched fire pots that ignited multiple sections of the city simultaneously, creating resource allocation dilemmas for defenders who couldn't address all fires at once. The resulting conflagration reportedly consumed entire districts, with Byzantine accounts describing desperate civilians forming bucket chains while military forces remained at the walls. Besiegers exploited the vulnerability of medieval urban architecture to fire. Most cities contained substantial wooden structures, particularly in residential areas, that could quickly become infernos when targeted with incendiary projectiles. During the 1346-1347 siege of Calais, English forces specifically targeted the thatched roofs of inner-city buildings with fire arrows and heated shot, creating secondary emergencies that drained defensive resources from the walls. The 1475 siege of Neuss saw Burgundian forces employing specialized incendiary projectiles containing mixtures of sulfur, pitch, and oil that proved nearly impossible to extinguish with water alone. The development of defensive countermeasures against bombardment revealed the ingenuity of besieged populations. Many cities created specialized fire brigades drawn from civilians unsuitable for combat roles. During the 1429 siege of Orleans, records describe dedicated teams of older men and women stationed throughout the city with barrels of water and sand, ready to address fires from incendiary projectiles. These teams operated under a chain of command separate from military leadership, allowing simultaneous management of both combat and fire emergencies. Physical modifications to urban structures also evolved to counter bombardment threats. Defenders hung dampened hides and woolen blankets on exterior walls to absorb the impact of projectiles and prevent fire arrows from igniting wooden structures. During the 1480 siege of Rhodes, the Knights Hospitaller ordered all available mattresses requisitioned to pad vulnerable wooden structures. More elaborately, during the 1453 siege of Constantinople, Byzantine defenders constructed timber frameworks filled with earth, stones, and debris to absorb the impact of Ottoman cannonballs, effectively creating sacrificial barriers in front of the ancient walls. The most innovative defensive measures involved active countermeasures against siege engines themselves. Defenders frequently conducted night sorties specifically targeting enemy artillery positions. During the 1218-1219 siege of Damietta, Muslim defenders conducted at least 7 documented raids against Crusader siege engines, successfully burning several trebuchets and delaying bombardment operations for weeks. Similarly, during the 1304 siege of Stirling, Scottish defenders attempted multiple night raids against Edward's Warwolf, though without success due to heavy guards placed around this valuable asset. When direct attacks proved impossible, defenders employed counter-battery fire from their own artillery. During the 1421 Hussite siege of Karlstegen Castle, defenders used precisely aimed ballista fire to target Hussite artillery crews, forcing the besiegers to operate their weapons from behind protective screens that reduced their accuracy. At the 1477 siege of Nancy, Burgundian artillery positions came under such effective counter-fire from the city's walls that they had to be relocated multiple times, disrupting bombardment schedules and allowing defenders to repair damaged sections. The most disturbing development in siege warfare emerged through the deliberate weaponization of disease. While medieval combatants lacked modern understanding of germ theory, they recognized the connection between corpses, waste, and illness. This observation led to the development of biological warfare tactics that targeted besieged populations already vulnerable due to compromised sanitation and nutrition. The most notorious example occurred during the 1346 siege of Kaffa, where Mongol forces reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls. According to Gabriel de Mussy's account, the Mongols ordered corpses to be placed on their catapults and lobbed into the city in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. While modern historians debate whether this action actually transmitted the plague, the psychological impact on defenders who witnessed decomposing bodies raining from the sky was undoubtedly severe. This practice was not isolated to the Mongols. During Frederick Barbarossa's 1155 siege of Tortona, imperial forces reportedly threw human and animal carcasses into the city's water sources to render them unusable. Similarly, during the 1422 siege of Karlstegen, Hussite forces catapulted human waste and animal carcasses over the walls, specifically to spread disease among the defenders. The 1340s siege of Stirling saw English forces using similar tactics against Scottish defenders, with contemporary accounts describing all manner of filth being launched into the castle. Dead animals proved particularly effective as biological weapons due to their rapid decomposition and the diseases they harbored. During the 1216 siege of Dover Castle, French forces reportedly catapulted dead horses and cattle into the castle bailey, creating immediate sanitation challenges for the defenders. The animals were often left to rot in summer heat for several days before being loaded into siege engines, maximizing their noxious potential. At the 1465 siege of Neuss, Burgundian forces allegedly collected diseased animals specifically for use as projectiles, recognizing their potential to spread illness among the defenders. The psychological impact of biological attacks extended beyond the immediate disease threat. The symbolic violation, represented by hurling decomposing flesh into living spaces, created profound psychological distress. During the 1099 siege of Jerusalem, Crusader chronicles describe Muslim defenders becoming sick with horror when decomposing pig carcasses were thrown into the city, an action deliberately calculated to offend Islamic sensibilities. This psychological warfare dimension often proved as effective as the actual disease transmission in undermining defender morale. Defenders developed countermeasures against biological attacks that revealed their intuitive understanding of disease transmission despite lacking formal germ theory. Many besieged communities organized specialized disposal teams responsible for quickly removing and burying or burning biological projectiles. During the 1422 Karlstetten siege, castle records describe a rotation system where specific servants were assigned daily to dispose of foul projectiles by burying them in lime pits outside the main living areas. The application of lime and other substances to biological waste reflected empirical understanding of disinfection principles. During the 1346-1347 Kaffa siege, Genoese defenders reportedly covered catapulted corpses with quicklime before burial, recognizing its disinfectant properties. Similarly, during the 1465 New siege, defenders used vinegar to wash areas contaminated by biological projectiles, an early form of chemical disinfection that proved surprisingly effective despite their limited understanding of microbiology. Physical bombardment and biological warfare converged in particularly horrific forms during extended sieges. At the 1241 siege of Pest, Mongol forces reportedly catapulted captured prisoners, still alive but mortally wounded, into the city. These human projectiles created both immediate horror and subsequent disease risk as they died within the walls. Similar accounts emerge from the 1346 siege of Kaffa, where living prisoners were allegedly bound and launched into the city to spread terror, and potentially disease they had contracted in the Mongol camp. The combined effect of physical bombardment and biological warfare created cumulative psychological trauma among besieged populations. Contemporary accounts frequently describe siege madness, a condition recognizable to modern clinicians as a combination of post-traumatic stress, sleep deprivation psychosis, and anxiety disorders. During the 1420 siege of Prague, chronicles describe defenders becoming increasingly erratic and prone to panic after weeks of bombardment and biological attacks, with some abandoning their posts during false alarms and others becoming catatonically unresponsive. Children proved particularly vulnerable to the psychological effects of bombardment. Unable to contextualize the experience or understand the strategic situation, they developed severe trauma responses that sometimes persisted for years after sieges concluded. During the 1487 siege of Malaga, accounts describe children who developed selective mutism after experiencing bombardment, while others displayed extreme startle responses to loud noises that persisted long after the city's fall. These descriptions match modern understanding of childhood trauma responses, suggesting that medieval children suffered significant psychological casualties during sieges. The civilian experience of bombardment differed fundamentally from that of military defenders. While soldiers maintained agency through active defense and countermeasures, civilians largely endured passive suffering as their homes and communities disintegrated around them. During the 1204 siege of Constantinople, Byzantine accounts describe civilians hiding in cellars for weeks, emerging only at night to seek food and water while bombardment temporarily ceased. This enforced passivity created profound psychological helplessness that undermined community resilience more effectively than direct attacks on defensive structures. The technological evolution of siege engines across the medieval period reflected an arms race between offensive and defensive innovations. Early medieval sieges relied primarily on scaling ladders, battering rams, and simple traction trebuchets. By the late 13th century, counterweight trebuchets could deliver devastating payloads with remarkable accuracy, forcing defensive adaptations like reinforced walls and angled surfaces designed to deflect projectiles. This technological competition reached its culmination with the introduction of gunpowder artillery in the 14th and 15th centuries, which fundamentally transformed the siege equation by rendering traditional high stone walls obsolete. The introduction of early cannon to European sieges in the mid-14th century initially supplemented rather than replaced traditional siege engines. These early bombards proved inaccurate, dangerous to their crews, and slow to reload, but their psychological impact far exceeded their physical effectiveness. During the 1377 siege of Oudenarde, Ghent rebels deployed primitive cannon whose thunderous reports reportedly caused women inside the city to miscarry from fear. The 1415 siege of Harfleur saw Henry V employ both traditional trebuchets and early cannon, with chronicles noting that defenders feared the sound of the cannon more than the actual damage they inflicted. As gunpowder artillery began transforming siege warfare in the late medieval period, a far older and more insidious threat continued to terrify defenders of besieged settlements: the silent, invisible progress of enemy miners tunneling beneath their walls. Unlike the thunderous bombardment that announced itself with each impact, mining operations proceeded in eerie quiet, leaving defenders to wonder where and when the ground might suddenly collapse beneath them. Mining operations dated back to ancient siege warfare, but reached new levels of sophistication during the medieval period. The basic principle remained consistent. Tunnelers would excavate a passage beneath a section of wall, support the tunnel roof with wooden props, pack the terminal chamber with combustible materials, and then ignite them to collapse the tunnel, and consequently, the fortifications above. During the 1215-1216 siege of Dover Castle, French engineers drove a tunnel directly beneath the castle's eastern tower, creating a chamber large enough to require 24 wooden pillars for support. When these were burned, the tower collapsed so completely that, according to contemporary accounts, not one stone remained standing upon another. The psychological impact of mining operations often exceeded their physical effect. Defenders lived with the constant knowledge that enemies might be working beneath them at any moment, creating a distinctive anxiety that contemporary accounts called miner's dread. During the 1302 siege of Stirling Castle, English chronicles describe Scottish defenders becoming increasingly agitated as they detected faint sounds of digging, but couldn't precisely locate their source. This uncertainty forced defenders to spread their forces thinly, checking multiple potential breakthrough points, rather than concentrating on actual mining locations. The specialized nature of medieval mining operations led to the development of dedicated mining guilds and experts who traveled between armies offering their services. These professionals, often drawn from mining regions like the Harz Mountains in Germany, Cornwall in England, or the Almaden region in Spain, brought specialized knowledge of geology, tunnel construction, and ventilation techniques. During the 1210-1211 Albigensian Crusade siege of Minerve, Simon de Montfort employed miners from the Île-de-France region who had developed techniques specifically for the limestone terrain of southern France. These mining specialists commanded premium wages, reflecting both their technical expertise and the extreme danger of their work. Records from Edward I's 1304 siege of Stirling show that mining specialists received 3 times the daily wage of ordinary soldiers. During Frederick II's 1247–1248 siege of Parma, imperial financial accounts indicate that professional miners from Swabia received payment partly in silver and partly in promised shares of plunder, an unusual arrangement that highlighted their value to the besieging force. The technical challenges of medieval mining operations required sophisticated solutions that belied the period's reputation for technological simplicity. Ventilation proved particularly crucial, as tunnels needed fresh air for both workers and, eventually, for the fires set to collapse the tunnel. During the 1304 Stirling siege, Edward's engineers constructed a series of air shafts disguised within larger earthworks to provide oxygen to miners working up to 400 feet from the tunnel entrance. At the 1421–1422 Hussite siege of Karlstetten, besiegers reportedly used bellows connected to leather tubes to force air into their deeper tunnels. Water management presented another significant challenge, particularly in regions with high water tables. During winter sieges, groundwater could quickly flood tunnels, drowning miners and rendering operations impossible. The 1214 siege of Rochester Castle saw King John's engineers struggle with repeated flooding until they developed a system of drainage channels and collection sumps that allowed work to continue despite heavy winter rains. This innovation contributed significantly to the eventual success of the mining operation that collapsed the castle's corner tower. Lighting within tunnels required careful consideration of both visibility and safety. Open flames consumed precious oxygen and risked igniting support timbers, while mining in darkness proved nearly impossible. During the 1249 siege of Damietta, Muslim engineers reportedly used reflective metal surfaces to direct sunlight into tunnel entrances, supplemented by carefully placed oil lamps at critical junctions. European miners more typically relied on enclosed lanterns designed to minimize fire risks while providing enough light for excavation work. The tools of medieval miners evolved specifically for siege applications. Traditional mining implements like picks and shovels were modified for quieter operation, with wooden handles wrapped in cloth to dampen sound and metal parts carefully maintained to prevent squeaking. During the 1302–1303 siege of Stirling, English accounts mention silent tools specifically designed for undermining operations. These specialized implements commanded high prices in medieval military markets, with records from the 1340 siege of Tournai showing that mining tools cost nearly 3 times their civilian equivalents. The soil removed from tunnels created obvious disposal challenges, as large excavation mounds would reveal the tunnel's location to defenders. Sophisticated besiegers distributed excavated soil widely throughout their camps or incorporated it into siege ramps and earthworks. During the 1453 siege of Constantinople, Ottoman miners reportedly carried soil away in small sacks distributed to different parts of the camp each night, preventing the accumulation of telling mounds that might reveal their mining locations to Byzantine observers. For defenders, detecting enemy mining operations became a specialized art combining technological solutions with human intelligence. The most basic detection method involved placing water-filled containers along vulnerable sections of wall. The vibrations from mining activity would disturb the water's surface, revealing tunneling below. During the 1216 Dover siege, English defenders reportedly placed metal dishes of water in suspected mining areas, watching for ripples that would betray French tunneling operations. More sophisticated detection methods involved acoustic monitoring. Defenders would place ear to ground or use primitive amplification devices to listen for tunneling sounds. During the 1304 Stirling siege, Scottish defenders lowered men on ropes along the exterior castle walls at night, having them press their ears against the ground to detect English mining activity. At Rhodes in 1480, the Knights Hospitaller reportedly used empty barrels placed on their sides as primitive acoustic amplifiers, with listeners placing their ears at one end to detect Ottoman mining operations. Once enemy tunnels were detected, defenders could implement various countermeasures. The most direct approach involved counter-mining, digging their own tunnels to intercept the attacker's passage. These counter-mines often led to fierce underground combat fought in nearly complete darkness. During the 1421-1422 siege of Karlstetten, Hussite and Catholic forces reportedly fought a 3-day underground battle when their tunnels intersected, using short spears, daggers, and improvised clubs in the confined space. These underground battles developed their own specialized tactics and equipment. Miners carried small shields designed for tunnel fighting, and some accounts mention the use of specialized short swords with limited swing requirements. During the 1249 Damietta siege, Muslim chronicles described defenders using tubes to blow powdered quicklime into intercepted Crusader tunnels, temporarily blinding the attackers and allowing Muslim counter-miners to attack with advantage. When direct counter-mining proved impossible, defenders sometimes dug shallow trenches inside their walls in anticipated breakthrough areas. These trenches would be concealed under normal flooring, but would cause enemy miners to break through into an empty space rather than directly into the fortification. During the 1304 Stirling siege, English accounts express frustration that several mining operations emerged in prepared Scottish trenches rather than in occupied areas of the castle, allowing defenders to quickly contain the breaches. Water could serve as both detection tool and weapon against mining operations. Defenders with access to abundant water sometimes flooded suspected mining areas, drowning enemy tunnelers or making excavation impossible. During the 1304 Stirling siege, Scottish defenders reportedly diverted rainwater into areas where they suspected English mining activity, temporarily halting operations. More dramatically, during the 1487 siege of Malaga, defenders breached their own cisterns to flood an area where Castilian mining had been detected, reportedly drowning 17 miners. The psychological warfare aspects of mining and counter-mining created distinctive social dynamics within besieged populations. Communities often designated listening watches, where civilians would take turns monitoring for mining sounds, creating a participatory defense that gave non-combatants active roles. During the 1429 Orleans siege, municipal records describe a rotation system where each parish provided listeners for 4-hour shifts along vulnerable sections of wall, with women and older men fully integrated into this crucial defensive measure. The psychological impact of successful mining operations often exceeded their military significance. When walls that had appeared impregnable suddenly collapsed, the shock could shatter defender morale more completely than weeks of bombardment. During the 1212 siege of Béziers, Albigensian defenders reportedly surrendered en masse after a single successful mining operation collapsed a section of wall, despite having successfully resisted conventional attacks for nearly a month. The sudden, catastrophic nature of mining breaches created a psychological impression of inevitability that undermined the will to continue resistance. Famous mining operations that secured victory. Medieval military history. Perhaps most significant was the Ottoman mining effort during the 1453 siege of Constantinople. Sultan Mehmed II recruited specialized miners from the silver mines of Serbia to tunnel beneath the ancient Theodosian walls. Byzantine defenders detected several tunnels and successfully intercepted them through counter-mining operations. However, on May 29, 1453, Ottoman miners successfully detonated a charge beneath a section of wall near the Blasharni Palace, creating a breach that contributed significantly to the final Ottoman assault that captured the city. The 1487 siege of Malaga similarly featured decisive mining operations. Castilian forces under Ferdinand and Isabella employed miners from northern Spain who specialized in the region's limestone geology. After several failed attempts detected by Muslim defenders, Castilian miners successfully collapsed a critical section of wall, leading directly to the city's capitulation. The psychological impact proved so significant that nearby settlements surrendered without resistance rather than face similar mining operations. Mining expertise transferred across cultural boundaries through practical experience rather than written treatises. When Frederick II besieged Faenza in 1240-1241, His engineering corps included Muslim mining specialists from Sicily who had preserved and developed techniques dating back to Byzantine and ancient Roman practices. During the Crusades, both Christian and Muslim forces adopted each other's mining innovations, creating a cross-cultural exchange of technical knowledge that transcended religious boundaries. By the 13th century, mining techniques had become remarkably consistent across the Mediterranean world, with similar approaches documented in Christian, Muslim, and Byzantine sources. The logistics of mining operations required substantial resources beyond the specialized personnel. Timber for shoring up tunnels represented a major requirement, with large operations consuming hundreds of trees. During Edward I's 1304 Stirling siege, royal accounts show procurement orders for over 3,000 oak timbers specifically designated for mining operations. Similarly, the 1453 Constantinople siege saw Ottoman forces dedicating entire supply chains to providing mining timber, with specialized wood cutting units assigned to support the Serbian mining teams. The combination of mining with conventional bombardment created particularly effective siege approaches. Defenders forced to spread their attention between multiple threats became increasingly vulnerable to both. During the 1304 Stirling siege, Edward I coordinated trebuchet bombardment with mining operations, timing increased bombardment to mask the sounds of mining activity. This integrated approach prevented Scottish defenders from effectively concentrating on either threat, contributing significantly to the castle's eventual fall. As gunpowder became more common in European warfare during the 14th and 15th centuries, mining operations incorporated explosive charges rather than simple fire to collapse tunnels. This development dramatically increased mining effectiveness while requiring new technical expertise. During the 1487 Malaga siege, Castilian miners used gunpowder charges carefully calculated based on the tunnel depth and wall thickness above. This technical sophistication represented a significant advance over earlier methods that relied on burning supports to cause collapses. The introduction of gunpowder to mining operations created new dangers for the miners themselves. Premature detonations, improperly calculated charges, and unexpected collapses killed numerous mining specialists. During the 1453 Constantinople siege, Ottoman accounts mention at least one catastrophic premature explosion that reportedly killed 40 miners. These accidents contributed to the high wages commanded by mining specialists, who literally risked burial alive each time they went to work. For civilians trapped in besieged settlements, the psychological terror of mining operations created distinctive trauma responses. Contemporary accounts describe earth anxiety among populations who had experienced mining attacks, with survivors developing heightened sensitivity to ground vibrations and irrational fears of collapsing floors. Following the 1212 Béziers siege, refugees reportedly refused to sleep in stone buildings, preferring tents or wooden structures that they believed would be less catastrophically affected by ground collapses. When city walls finally gave way, whether from relentless bombardment, successful mining operations, or direct assault, the worst horrors of medieval siege warfare were only beginning. The breach of a city's defenses marked the transition from the methodical suffering of encirclement to the chaotic violence of direct combat in streets never designed for warfare. For civilians who had endured months of hunger, disease, and bombardment, the final assault represented their most vulnerable moment, when the thin line of defenders separating them from enemy forces finally collapsed. The moment of breach triggered predictable patterns across medieval sieges. Defenders typically attempted last-ditch concentrations of forces at breach points, creating desperate fighting over rubble and collapsed masonry. During the 1099 siege of Jerusalem, Fatimid defenders rushed reinforcements to the northern wall when Crusader forces created a workable breach, fighting from improvised barricades of debris and overturned carts. This final defensive effort often proved particularly bloody, as defenders recognized they were fighting not just for the city, but for their own survival. Civilian populations responded to breaches with predictable panic. Contemporary accounts describe mass flights towards city centers, religious sanctuaries, or secondary defensive positions. During the 1204 sack of Constantinople, Byzantine sources recount how civilians fled toward the Hagia Sophia Cathedral, believing its sacred status might offer protection from Latin crusaders. This concentration of non-combatants in predictable locations often created vulnerable targets for the most brutal aspects of medieval urban combat. The tactical doctrine of medieval warfare included the concept of storm and sack, the understanding that cities taken by assault rather than negotiated surrender were legitimate targets for unrestricted plunder. This principle, recognized across Christian and Islamic military traditions, created catastrophic consequences for civilian populations. Commanders often explicitly promised their troops the wealth of targeted cities to motivate them through difficult siege conditions. Before the final assault on Constantinople in 1204, Venetian and Crusader leaders methodically divided the anticipated plunder, assigning specific districts to different contingents to minimize conflicts between allied forces. The historical record of civilian casualties during medieval city sacks reveals horrifying consistency. When Jerusalem fell to Crusader forces in 1099, contemporary chronicles from both Christian and Muslim sources estimate between 10,000 and 30,000 civilian deaths, representing the majority of the city's population. Raymond of Aguilars, an eyewitness, wrote that men rode in blood up to their knees in bridal reins in the temple area where many civilians had sought refuge. While likely hyperbolic, this account reflects the scale of violence that accompanied the city's capture. The 1204 sack of Constantinople by Fourth Crusade forces provides another well-documented example of post-breach atrocities. Byzantine sources estimate approximately 2,000 civilian deaths during the initial fighting and subsequent three-day sack, a lower percentage of the total population than Jerusalem, but still representing massive casualties in the medieval world's largest Christian city. Nyctas Choniates, a Byzantine official who witnessed the sack, described crusaders dragging the sick from hospital beds to search for concealed valuables and slaughtering clerics who attempted to protect church treasures. Casualty patterns reflected the chaotic nature of urban combat following breaches. Initial fighting typically concentrated at breach points and along main approach routes to city centers, creating zones of extreme violence. During the 1415 capture of Harfleur, English accounts describe heaps of the dead near the eastern gate where the main breach occurred. As attacking forces secured control of major thoroughfares, violence typically dispersed throughout the settlement, with smaller groups of soldiers breaking off to loot residential areas and hunt for valuable plunder. The demographic profile of casualties reveals the particularly vulnerable position of certain groups. Working-age men suffered high casualties during initial fighting, as they formed the bulk of last-ditch defensive forces. Once these defenders broke, elderly men, women, and children became primary victims during the subsequent sack. Archaeological evidence from mass graves following the 1211 Albigensian Crusade capture of Lavore shows disproportionate numbers of female and juvenile remains, suggesting targeted violence against these groups after combat resistance had ended. Medieval laws of war theoretically provided some protection for civilians, but these protections frequently collapsed during actual city captures. Christian theological tradition, drawing on Augustine and later developed by Thomas Aquinas, distinguished between combatants and non-combatants, theoretically protecting the latter from direct violence. Islamic jurisprudence similarly developed the concept of non-combatant immunity, with specific protections for women, children, the elderly, and religious figures who weren't directly participating in combat. However, these theoretical protections rarely survived contact with the realities of medieval urban combat. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant blurred when civilian populations participated in defensive measures like dropping stones on attackers or pouring boiling liquids from walls. During the 1248 siege of Seville, Castilian chronicles note that Muslim women and children had actively participated in defense, which crusaders later used to justify violence against these groups after breaching the walls. More fundamentally, the promise of plunder inherently undermined non-combatant protections. When soldiers fought for months with the expectation of wealth upon victory, commanders found it nearly impossible to restrain them once breaches occurred. Before the 1204 assault on Constantinople, Crusader leaders and clergy issued specific orders against killing women, children, and clergy, orders that were almost immediately ignored once the walls were breached and looting began. Religious buildings theoretically enjoyed special protection during medieval warfare, but these sanctuaries frequently became scenes of particular violence. When Jerusalem fell in 1099, thousands of Muslim civilians sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, believing its sacred status would protect them. Instead, Crusader chronicles describe systematic slaughter within the mosque complex, with attackers viewing the killing of Muslims in Islamic holy sites as particularly meritorious. Similarly, during the 1204 sack of Constantinople, Latin crusaders specifically targeted Orthodox churches and monasteries, seeing their wealth as legitimate prizes and viewing Greek Orthodox Christians as schismatics whose religious sites deserved no special protection. Sexual violence emerged as a consistent feature of medieval city captures, despite explicit prohibitions in both Christian and Islamic legal traditions. When Acre fell to Mamluk forces in 1291, Muslim chronicles acknowledge widespread rape of Christian women despite religious prohibitions. The 1204 sack of Constantinople saw similar patterns, with Nyctes Choniates describing noble maids who had dedicated their virginity to God being dragged from convents and assaulted by crusaders. These accounts appear consistently enough across different cultural contexts to confirm that sexual violence represented a standard feature of medieval city captures rather than exceptional behavior. The duration of post-breach violence followed predictable patterns across medieval sieges. Initial fighting typically lasted hours rather than days, with organized resistance collapsing once attackers established control of multiple sections within the settlement. The subsequent sack period, characterized by looting, property destruction, and violence against civilians, typically lasted between 1 and 3 days. During the 1204 Constantinople sack, Latin leaders had agreed beforehand on a 3-day period of unrestricted plunder, after which order would be restored. Similarly, when Mamluk forces captured Acre in 1291, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil allowed a 2-day period of plunder before ordering his troops to restore order. This pattern reflected practical military considerations rather than humanitarian concerns. Extended periods of unrestricted looting threatened discipline among attacking forces and increased risks of accidental fires that might destroy valuable infrastructure. When Mehmed II captured Constantinople in 1453, he reportedly limited the sack to 1 day specifically to prevent destruction of the city he intended to make his new capital. This pragmatic approach characterized most medieval commanders, who balanced the need to reward troops through plunder against the desire to preserve captured territory's value. Survivor accounts from famous medieval city captures provide haunting testimonies to the experience of civilians during these catastrophic events. Nyctes Choniates left perhaps the most detailed eyewitness account of the 1204 Constantinople sack, describing his family's flight through the burning city while Crusader forces looted his home. He recounts hiding his young daughter under a pile of rags in a small boat to prevent her from being assaulted, and describes encountering a Crusader soldier who, in a rare act of mercy, helped guide his family to safety outside the city walls. For Jerusalem in 1099, we have fewer direct civilian accounts, but multiple chroniclers from both sides documented the aftermath. Ibn al-Athir, writing from Muslim accounts, described how the population was put to the sword and the Crusaders spent a week slaughtering Muslims. They killed more than 70,000 people in Al-Aqsa Mosque. While this number is almost certainly exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms mass killings throughout the city, with excavations revealing hasty burial pits containing multiple bodies showing evidence of violent death. The psychological trauma experienced by survivors created lasting impacts on medieval urban populations. Chronicles written years after city captures often contain detailed descriptions of atrocities, suggesting the deep psychological imprint these events left on witnesses. Survivors frequently displayed symptoms recognizable to modern clinicians as post-traumatic stress disorder, including intrusive memories, hypervigilance, and avoidance behaviors. Following the 1204 sack of Constantinople, Byzantine sources describe residents who abandoned stone houses to live in wooden structures they could quickly flee, suggesting persistent hypervigilance and fear of being trapped during future attacks. Children who survived city captures exhibited particularly severe trauma responses. Byzantine accounts following the 1204 sack describe children who stopped speaking entirely after witnessing violence against family members, and others who developed persistent startle responses to loud noises resembling fighting. These descriptions match modern understanding of childhood trauma responses, suggesting that medieval children experienced psychological injuries that likely affected them throughout their lives. The aftermath of city captures created distinctive patterns of population displacement. Many survivors fled permanently rather than remaining under new rulership, creating refugee populations that could destabilize surrounding regions. After Jerusalem's capture in 1099, Muslim and Jewish survivors scattered throughout the Levant, with many seeking refuge in Damascus and other Muslim-controlled cities. Similarly, following Constantinople's fall in 1204, thousands of Byzantine elites fled to successor states like Nicaea and Epirus, taking with them administrative expertise and cultural knowledge. For those who remained in captured cities, the transition to new rulership brought additional challenges. Conquering forces typically imposed new religious, linguistic, and administrative systems that marginalized native populations. After Jerusalem's capture, Crusader authorities established Latin Christian religious dominance, converting mosques to churches and restricting Muslim and Jewish religious practices. In Constantinople after 1204, Latin authorities replaced Greek Orthodox clergy with Latin counterparts and imposed Western feudal structures on a society accustomed to Byzantine governance. The economic impact of city captures extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Medieval cities functioned as complex economic ecosystems dependent on specialized labor, established trade networks, and accumulated capital. The disruption caused by violent captures frequently destroyed these systems beyond easy recovery. When Crusaders captured Constantinople in 1204, they not only looted portable wealth, but also dismantled bronze statues and architectural elements for their metal value, destroying cultural treasures and economic assets simultaneously. The looting that accompanied medieval city captures followed hierarchical patterns reflecting the social organization of attacking forces. Elite commanders typically claimed high-value targets like palaces, treasuries, and major religious buildings. During the 1204 Constantinople sack, Venetian forces specifically targeted the Hagia Sophia and imperial treasury, securing the most valuable portable wealth. Common soldiers focused on residential areas, taking portable valuables and often destroying what they couldn't carry out of frustration or to deny resources to competitors. Certain categories of plunder held particular value in medieval warfare. Relics, physical remains of saints or objects associated with holy figures, represented especially prized targets. The 1204 sack of Constantinople resulted in the transfer of numerous important relics to Western Europe, including purported fragments of the True Cross and the Crown of Thorns. These sacred objects held both religious and political value, as cities that acquired important relics gained prestige and pilgrim traffic that translated into economic advantages. Human captives represented another valuable form of plunder, with high-status prisoners worth substantial ransoms. When Jerusalem fell in 1099, Crusaders spared certain elite Muslim residents specifically for ransom purposes. More commonly, ordinary civilians were captured for slave markets, particularly in Mediterranean conflicts between Christian and Muslim forces. When Mamluk forces captured Acre in 1291, thousands of surviving Christians were marched to slave markets in Cairo and Damascus, with women and children fetching particularly high prices. The historical memory of city captures shaped medieval urban development for generations. Cities that had experienced violent captures frequently redesigned their defenses based on lessons learned from previous failures. After recovering Constantinople in 1261, Byzantine authorities strengthened specific sections of wall that had proven vulnerable during the 1204 capture. Similarly, Muslim cities in the Levant adapted their defenses based on observed Crusader siege tactics, developing features like bent entrances and reinforced gates that addressed specific vulnerabilities. Surviving a medieval city capture ultimately depended on a combination of preparation, location, status, and simple luck. Civilians who had established evacuation plans, secured valuables for potential bribes, or developed connections with members of the attacking force stood better chances than those caught unprepared. During the 1204 Constantinople sack, residents who had previously established relationships with Venetian merchants were sometimes able to secure protection for their households. Similarly, during the 1099 Jerusalem capture, certain Muslim elites negotiated surrender terms that allowed them safe passage from the city before the final assault. For ordinary civilians without such advantages, survival often depended on finding effective hiding places during the initial violence and emerging only after order had been restored. Urban infrastructure like cisterns, sewers, and storage cellars served as improvised shelters during many medieval city captures. Archaeological evidence from the 1211 capture of Béziers during the Albigensian Crusade suggests that some civilians hid in wine cellars and grain storage facilities, with human remains discovered in these locations showing no evidence of violent death, suggesting they may have suffocated or starved while hiding from attackers. The decision to surrender a besieged settlement represented perhaps the most consequential choice medieval defenders ever made. As walls crumbled, food stores emptied, and disease spread, military leaders and civilian authorities faced an impossible calculation: continue resistance with diminishing hope of relief, or negotiate terms with enemies who had already demonstrated their capacity for destruction. This decision process unfolded within complex political frameworks that balanced military realities against cultural expectations of honor, religious obligations, and the fundamental drive for survival. Formal surrender negotiations typically began with carefully choreographed communications between besiegers and defenders. The initial approach often came from the attacking force, usually after they had demonstrated their capability to take the settlement by force. During the 1304 siege of Stirling Castle, Edward I's representatives approached the Scottish garrison with written terms only after his massive trebuchet, Warwolf, had demolished a section of the outer wall, providing tangible evidence of the English capacity to eventually breach the defenses completely. The physical process of these negotiations followed established protocols designed to protect both parties. Typically, defenders would lower a representative from the walls on a rope or basket, or temporarily cease hostilities to allow a delegation to exit through a gate under a flag of truce. During the 1248-1249 siege of Seville, Muslim defenders sent negotiators through a small postern gate, with Castilian chronicles noting that these emissaries were blindfolded while being escorted through Christian siege works to prevent them from gathering intelligence. The content of surrender terms varied widely based on the specific military, political, and religious context of each siege. In conflicts between Christian powers, terms typically focused on practical matters like the disposition of weapons, treatment of garrison members, and civilian property rights. When Philip II of France accepted the surrender of Château-Gaillard in 1204, he allowed the English garrison to depart with personal weapons and possessions, but required them to leave behind all military equipment and swear not to fight against French forces for 1 year. Religious wars generally produced harsher surrender terms, particularly when defenders had rejected earlier opportunities to capitulate. During the Albigensian Crusade, Simon de Montfort offered relatively lenient terms to Cathar strongholds that surrendered before siege equipment was assembled, but dramatically worse conditions afterward. At Minerve in 1210, early surrender offers included guarantees of life for all inhabitants willing to reconcile with the Catholic Church. After weeks of siege, these terms degraded to guarantees only for Catholics, with Cathars facing forced conversion or execution. The timing of surrender negotiations critically affected the terms defenders could secure. Early surrenders, before besiegers had invested significant resources in siege works and equipment, typically received more favorable conditions. When Philip Augustus besieged Normandy's castles in 1204, following his victory at Château-Gaillard, multiple garrisons surrendered immediately upon his arrival, receiving generous terms that included safe passage for all personnel and retention of personal property. By contrast, garrisons that resisted until the last possible moment typically faced harsher treatment, as besiegers sought to recover their significant investments of time and resources. The most favorable surrender terms, known as honors of war, allowed defenders to march out with weapons, flags flying, and drums beating, essentially acknowledging their honorable defense while transferring control of the fortification. When Spanish forces surrendered Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492 after a 10-month siege, they negotiated terms that included not only safe passage, but also guarantees of religious freedom, property rights, and cultural autonomy for the Muslim population. These exceptionally generous terms reflected both the Nasrid defenders' strong negotiating position and the Catholic monarch's desire to conclude their reconquest with minimal additional bloodshed. At the opposite extreme, surrenders that came after particularly prolonged or costly sieges sometimes resulted in terms offering little more than bare survival. When Mamluk forces captured Acre in 1291, ending the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil initially offered terms that guaranteed lives but required abandonment of all property. As negotiations dragged on and some defenders continued fighting, these terms deteriorated until the final assault resulted in mass killing and enslavement of survivors, demonstrating how quickly surrender terms could collapse when besiegers lost patience. The status of negotiators significantly influenced surrender outcomes. High-ranking nobles or religious leaders could often secure better terms than military officers alone, particularly when they had personal connections to the besieging leadership. During the 1265 siege of Kenilworth Castle during England's Second Barons' War, the papal legate Ottobuono di Fieschi mediated surrender terms that proved remarkably lenient given the rebels' prolonged resistance against royal authority. His involvement provided both sides with a face-saving intermediary who could frame the surrender as reconciliation rather than defeat. The treatment of different population segments within surrendered settlements revealed the hierarchical values of medieval society. Military garrisons typically received the most attention in surrender negotiations, with their treatment specified in detail. Civilian populations often received less explicit protection, with their fate determined by broader conventions of warfare rather than specific negotiated terms. Religious minorities frequently faced the harshest outcomes, particularly in conflicts with religious dimensions. When Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin in 1187, he negotiated specific ransom arrangements for Latin Christians while granting Eastern Christians and Jews more favorable terms, a reverse of the treatment these groups had received when Crusaders captured the city in 1099. Women and children occupied particularly vulnerable positions in surrender negotiations. While medieval conventions theoretically protected these groups, practical implementation varied widely. When Philip II captured Château-Gaillard in 1204, the non-combatants expelled by the English garrison during the siege received no protection in the surrender terms, having already been abandoned by both sides. By contrast, when Damietta surrendered to Louis IX in 1249 during the Seventh Crusade, the terms specifically guaranteed protection for Muslim women and children, allowing them to depart with personal possessions. The logistics of implementing surrender terms created practical challenges that sometimes undermined negotiated protections. Transporting large populations safely through hostile territory required substantial resources and disciplined escort forces. When Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin in 1187, he provided military escorts for departing Christians to reach Christian-held territories, but contemporary accounts describe how some groups were nonetheless attacked by Bedouin raiders beyond Saladin's direct control. This implementation gap between negotiated terms and practical realities created significant risks for surrendering populations. The role of hostages in guaranteeing surrender terms represented a common feature of medieval negotiations. High-status individuals from the surrendering population would be transferred to the victor's custody until all terms had been fulfilled. When Stirling Castle surrendered to Edward I in 1304, the Scottish commander Sir William Oliphant became a personal hostage to the English king until the entire garrison had disarmed and departed. Similarly, when Acre surrendered to Richard the Lionheart in 1191, Saladin provided high-ranking emirs as hostages until all agreed payments had been made and Christian prisoners released. Religious and cultural differences significantly impacted surrender negotiations between Christian and Muslim forces. Both traditions maintained concepts of honorable surrender, but with different emphases and exceptions. Islamic jurisprudence developed detailed frameworks for treating surrendered populations, distinguishing between those who capitulated before fighting began and those who resisted until military defeat. Christian traditions similarly distinguished between different surrender scenarios, but placed greater emphasis on religious identity as a determining factor in treatment. Despite these differences, practical surrender negotiations between Christian and Muslim forces often achieved workable compromises that both sides considered honorable. When Saladin captured Jerusalem in 1187, he negotiated terms that satisfied both Islamic legal requirements and Christian concerns about civilian protection. Similarly, when Spanish forces accepted Granada's surrender in 1492, the terms acknowledged both Christian victory and Muslim dignity through carefully crafted language acceptable to both religious traditions. The psychological aspects of surrender negotiations revealed the complex interplay between practical military calculations and cultural concepts of honor. Defenders often requested symbolic concessions that preserved their dignity while conceding military defeat. When French forces surrendered Harfleur to Henry V in 1415, they negotiated the right to surrender the keys to the town directly to the king rather than his subordinates, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged their submission to royal authority rather than military defeat. Similarly, when Mamluk forces accepted the surrender of cracked Chevaliers in 1271, they allowed the Hospitaller Knights to depart with their personal weapons and religious relics, preserving the order's honor despite their military failure. Famous last stands, situations where defenders rejected surrender terms and fought to the death, represented powerful cultural symbols in medieval warfare, though they were statistically rare compared to negotiated surrenders. The 1521 Ottoman siege of Belgrade ended with the Serbian defenders fighting to the last man rather than accepting terms they considered dishonorable. This decision reflected not just military calculation, but cultural values that placed honor above survival in certain contexts. Similarly, the 1487 siege of Malaga saw a faction of Muslim defenders reject surrender terms and fight to the death, even as city leaders attempted to negotiate. The language used in surrender documents revealed sophisticated diplomatic crafting that allowed both sides to claim favorable outcomes. Terms were carefully worded to avoid explicit acknowledgement of defeat while still transferring control of the contested settlement. When Philip Augustus accepted the surrender of Rouen in 1204, completing his conquest of Normandy, the documents described the city, placing itself under the protection of the French crown, rather than surrendering, language that allowed civic leaders to maintain dignity while acknowledging the military reality. The physical implementation of surrenders followed carefully choreographed sequences designed to prevent misunderstandings or violence during the transition of power. Typically, the departing garrison would exit through a single gate, while besieging forces entered through another, preventing direct contact between hostile forces during this vulnerable period. When Acre surrendered to Richard I in 1191, Muslim defenders departed through the eastern gate, while Crusader forces simultaneously entered through the northern gate, maintaining separation between forces that had been actively killing each other just days earlier. The aftermath of surrenders revealed significant variation in how thoroughly terms were respected by victorious forces. while medieval chronicles contain many examples of honorable adherence to negotiated terms, they also document numerous violations. When Jerusalem surrendered to Crusader forces in 1099, initial protection guarantees for the Muslim population collapsed into widespread massacre once Western forces gained control of the city. Conversely, when Saladin recaptured the city in 1187, his forces largely respected the negotiated terms despite opportunities for revenge. The treatment of religious buildings and sacred objects received particular attention in surrender negotiations, reflecting their cultural significance beyond military value. When Constantinople surrendered to Ottoman forces in 1453, the terms specifically addressed the status of churches, with some converted to mosques while others remained in Christian hands. Similarly, when Granada surrendered in 1492, the terms included detailed provisions regarding mosques and Islamic religious practices, though these protections eroded in subsequent decades as Spanish policy shifted toward forced conversion. For common soldiers and civilians caught in besieged settlements, the politics of surrender often seemed distant from their immediate survival concerns. Contemporary accounts frequently describe pressure from civilian populations for military commanders to accept terms as conditions deteriorated, creating internal tensions that besiegers deliberately exploited. During the 1429 Siege of Orleans, English commanders sent messages specifically targeting the civilian population, offering them protection if they forced the French garrison to surrender, a psychological tactic designed to create division between military and civilian authorities. The historical record of medieval surrenders reveals that negotiated capitulation represented the conclusion of most sieges rather than the dramatic assaults emphasized in popular culture. This preference for negotiated outcomes reflected rational calculations by both attackers and defenders. Besiegers avoided the casualties and uncertainty of direct assaults, while defenders secured at least minimal protections for themselves and civilian populations. This pragmatic approach to warfare, balancing military necessity against humanitarian considerations, represents an important counterpoint to simplistic views of medieval combat as universally brutal and unrestrained. The morning after a siege ended often revealed a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Whether through negotiated surrender or violent conquest, the cessation of hostilities marked not an end but a beginning, the start of a recovery process that might span decades or even generations. For survivors emerging from cellars and hiding places, the task of rebuilding shattered lives commenced amid ruins still smoldering from the final assault. The demographic impact of medieval sieges proved consistently devastating across regions and centuries. Population losses during major sieges frequently reached 30–50% of pre-siege inhabitants, creating generational gaps in urban communities. After the 1248 capture of Seville, Castilian records indicate the Muslim population had decreased by approximately 40%, with similar patterns documented following the 1099 capture of Jerusalem. These losses stemmed not only from direct violence, but from the combined effects of starvation, disease, and post-siege emigration, as survivors sought more stable environments. The 1204 sack of Constantinople provides perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of siege-related demographic collapse. Byzantine sources estimate the city's pre-siege population at approximately 400,000, making it medieval Europe's largest urban center. Within 5 years of the Latin conquest, that number had fallen below 100,000 through a combination of siege casualties, deliberate emigration to Byzantine successor states, and the collapse of economic systems that had previously sustained the population. This 75% reduction transformed a thriving metropolis into a collection of partially inhabited districts separated by abandoned neighborhoods and agricultural fields, a pattern visible in archaeological evidence showing rural features like vineyards and grazing areas within the city walls during the Latin occupation period. Age and gender distributions in post-siege populations revealed distinctive patterns that complicated recovery efforts. Working-age men typically suffered disproportionate casualties during both siege operations and final assaults, creating communities dominated by women, children, and the elderly. After the 1415 capture of Harfleur, English administrative records show a population with approximately 3 women for every adult man, a gender imbalance that persisted for nearly a decade. This demographic distortion created immediate labor shortages for physically demanding reconstruction work, while simultaneously leaving many households without primary breadwinners. The physical reconstruction of siege-damaged settlements followed predictable prioritization patterns that reflected both practical necessities and social hierarchies. Defensive infrastructure typically received first attention, with walls and gates repaired even before housing in many cases. When Acre returned to Christian control in 1191, Richard I immediately directed resources toward repairing the breached sections of wall before addressing internal damage. This prioritization reflected the continuing military threat that necessitated restored defenses before normal urban functions could resume. Water and food systems followed closely in reconstruction priorities. Wells required clearing of debris and testing for contamination from decomposed bodies or waste. Bakeries and mills needed immediate restoration to process whatever grain supplies remained or could be imported. After the 1248 Seville capitulation, Ferdinand III directed his engineers to restore the Roman aqueduct system within the first month of occupation, recognizing that clean water access would determine whether his forces could maintain control of the newly conquered city. Housing reconstruction revealed clear social stratification in post-siege recovery. Elite residences and religious buildings typically received priority attention and resources, while common housing often remained in damaged condition for years. Following the 1204 sack of Constantinople, Latin authorities quickly restored the Great Palace and major churches, while leaving entire residential districts in ruins. This pattern appears consistently across medieval Europe, with archaeological evidence from numerous siege sites showing rapid reconstruction of elite spaces alongside prolonged disrepair in common neighborhoods. The financing of post-siege reconstruction created complex challenges for medieval governments. The same conflict that damaged cities typically depleted treasury resources, creating funding shortfalls precisely when rebuilding demands peaked. Medieval authorities developed various approaches to this dilemma, including special taxation, property confiscation, and incentive programs for private reconstruction. After Philip II captured Rouen in 1204, completing his conquest of Normandy, he implemented a graduated tax system that placed heavier burdens on undamaged properties to subsidize reconstruction of severely affected areas, an early form of disaster redistribution. Religious institutions played crucial roles in post-siege recovery, leveraging their institutional continuity and property holdings to stabilize shattered communities. Monasteries and cathedral chapters frequently provided emergency housing, distributed food from ecclesiastical estates, and organized labor for reconstruction projects. After the 1248 capture of Seville, Castilian church authorities converted mosque properties to Christian use, while simultaneously establishing hospitals and food distribution centers for the remaining Muslim population, combining religious transformation with practical humanitarian assistance. Labor shortages presented persistent challenges for post-siege reconstruction efforts. The combination of population losses and injured survivors unable to perform heavy labor created workforce deficits that medieval authorities addressed through various means. Mandatory labor service requirements became common features of post-siege governance, with surviving males required to contribute specific days of work to public reconstruction projects. After the 1415 capture of Harfleur, Henry V implemented a rotation system requiring all able-bodied male residents to provide 3 days weekly on wall repairs, regardless of their normal occupation or social status. More sustainable solutions involved immigration incentives designed to attract new residents to depopulated areas. When Ferdinand III captured Seville in 1248, he offered tax exemptions, property grants and guild membership to Christian settlers willing to relocate to the newly conquered city. Similarly, after the Ottoman capture of Constantinople in 1453, Mehmed II implemented a systematic repopulation program that brought families from throughout the Ottoman Empire to the depleted capital, offering property rights and tax benefits to those willing to rebuild abandoned neighborhoods. The psychological trauma of siege experiences created less visible but equally significant recovery challenges. Contemporary accounts describe siege melancholy affecting survivors for years after hostilities ended, a condition recognizable to modern clinicians as post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms included sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, intrusive memories, and emotional numbing that impaired normal functioning. After the 1204 Constantinople sack, Byzantine accounts describe survivors who started at every loud noise and wept without cause years after the city's fall, suggesting persistent psychological injuries that complicated community recovery. Children exhibited particularly severe and long-lasting trauma responses to siege experiences. Medieval chronicles describe children who stopped speaking after witnessing siege violence, developed persistent fears of loud noises resembling bombardment, or displayed regressive behaviors like bedwetting and separation anxiety years after sieges concluded. These descriptions match modern understanding of childhood trauma responses and suggest that siege experiences created generational psychological damage that affected community functioning long after physical reconstruction had concluded. The commemoration of siege experiences through formal and informal means helped communities process collective trauma while establishing new cultural identities. Religious observances frequently marked siege anniversaries, with specialized masses commemorating both defenders who perished and the community's survival. After Orleans' successful resistance against English forces in 1429, the city established an annual procession that continues in modified form nearly 600 years later, demonstrating the extraordinary persistence of siege commemoration in urban identity. Architectural commemoration incorporated siege experiences into the physical fabric of rebuilt cities. Preserved breach sections, incorporated cannonballs, and commemorative inscriptions transformed defensive structures from purely military features into monuments to community survival. When Constantinople's walls were repaired after the unsuccessful 1422 Ottoman siege, Byzantine authorities embedded several enemy cannonballs in the reconstructed sections, with inscriptions noting the city's deliverance, creating visible reminders of survival that remained until the city's eventual fall in 1453. Literary commemoration through chronicles, poems, and songs preserved siege experiences for future generations, while shaping how communities understood their own histories. These accounts frequently emphasized themes of divine intervention, exceptional heroism, and community solidarity, creating narratives that supported recovery by emphasizing resilience rather than victimization. The Orleans mystery plays developed in the decades following the city's famous 1429 siege portrayed the English withdrawal as divine deliverance facilitated by Joan of Arc, transforming a traumatic military experience into a spiritual triumph that reinforced community identity. The practical lessons of siege experiences profoundly influenced subsequent urban development across medieval Europe, creating distinctive patterns visible in surviving city layouts. Settlements that had experienced significant siege damage typically rebuilt with wider streets, improved water access, and more distributed food storage, addressing specific vulnerabilities revealed during their ordeals. After Frederick Barbarossa's destructive 1162 siege of Milan, the rebuilt city incorporated multiple independent water systems, decentralized food markets, and wider avenues that could accommodate emergency movement of people and resources during future conflicts. Defensive architecture evolved directly in response to siege experiences, with modifications addressing specific vulnerabilities that had proved costly. After Philip II's 1204 capture of Shadow, Gaillard threw a toilet chute in the outer wall, castle designs across Europe modified waste disposal systems to eliminate similar weaknesses. More broadly, the increasing effectiveness of trebuchet bombardment led to the development of rounded tower designs that better deflected projectiles, with straight wall sections systematically replaced throughout the 13th century based on observed damage patterns from previous sieges. Emergency provisioning systems underwent systematic enhancement following siege experiences, with many cities establishing permanent granaries maintained specifically for crisis situations. After the 1248 capture of Seville, where starvation had contributed significantly to the Muslim garrison's surrender, Ferdinand III established a royal granary system requiring annual contributions from surrounding agricultural areas specifically earmarked for emergency use. Similar systems developed across Europe, with civic authorities calculating minimum grain requirements for their populations and maintaining reserves that frequently represented 6-12 months of emergency consumption. Water security received particular attention in post-siege urban planning, with cities developing redundant systems to prevent the water deprivation that had proved decisive in many sieges. Cistern construction increased dramatically in Mediterranean regions, with archaeological evidence showing systematic expansion of water storage capacity following siege experiences. Constantinople's massive underground cisterns, capable of supplying the city for months during complete blockade, represented the most sophisticated example of this approach, but similar systems developed at smaller scales throughout medieval Europe and the Islamic world. The long-term economic impact of sieges created recovery challenges that sometimes persisted for generations. Beyond immediate physical destruction, sieges disrupted commercial networks, depleted capital reserves, and damaged productive infrastructure like mills, kilns, and workshops. The specialized nature of medieval urban economies meant that the loss of particular artisan communities through death or emigration could eliminate entire industries from a city's economic profile. After the 1204 sack of Constantinople, the city's famous silk industry nearly disappeared as skilled workers fled to Nicaea, Trebizond, and other Byzantine successor states, taking their specialized knowledge and commercial connections with them. The recovery of international trade connections proved particularly challenging for cities that had experienced prolonged sieges. Commercial partners developed alternative supply chains during blockades, establishing new relationships that proved difficult to displace once conflicts ended. After Acre's recapture by Christian forces in 1191, Italian merchants who had redirected their Levanten trade through Tyre and other ports proved reluctant to re-establish operations in the damaged city despite political pressure, delaying economic recovery despite significant reconstruction investments. The transformation of urban governance frequently accompanied post-siege recovery, with new political arrangements emerging from the crucible of shared suffering. Cities that had experienced significant internal conflicts during sieges often implemented reforms designed to prevent similar divisions in future crises. After the 1462 Barcelona siege, where class tensions had emerged over food distribution, the city council was permanently expanded to include guild representatives with specific oversight of emergency provisioning, an institutional change that persisted until the 18th century. The demographic recovery from severe siege losses typically required decades rather than years, with population growth constrained by the medieval economy's limited capacity to support rapid urban expansion. After the 1248 capture of Seville, the city required approximately 75 years to regain its pre-siege population, despite significant immigration incentives and political importance as a Castilian administrative center. This extended recovery timeline characterized most major medieval sieges, with few cities returning to pre-siege population levels in less than a generation. The memory of siege experiences remained embedded in urban consciousness long after physical recovery had concluded, emerging in civic rituals, architectural features, and local identities that persisted for centuries. The citizens of Siena still commemorate their successful resistance against Florentine forces in 1555, processing annually with neighborhood banners that replicate medieval defensive assignments. Similarly, Dubrovnik's civic identity remains intertwined with memories of successful resistance against numerous sieges, with the city walls, maintained for centuries after losing their military relevance, serving as physical embodiments of community resilience. This persistence of siege memory reflects both the traumatic intensity of these experiences and their formative role in shaping medieval urban identities. For communities that survived these ordeals, siege experiences represented defining moments of collective action against existential threats, crucibles that forged distinctive civic consciousness from shared suffering. The walls that medieval cities built for protection thus served dual purposes: physical defense against external enemies and psychological boundaries, defining community membership through common experience. As we conclude our examination of medieval siege experiences, we find that these events represented far more than military operations. They were complex social dramas that tested and transformed every aspect of urban life. From the physical devastation of bombardment to the psychological trauma of starvation, from class conflicts over dwindling resources to remarkable examples of community solidarity, siege warfare exposed both the fragility and resilience of medieval urban society. The recovery processes that followed these ordeals, extending across decades and generations, revealed the extraordinary capacity of medieval communities to rebuild not just their walls and buildings, but their collective identities, transforming catastrophic experiences into foundations for future resilience. The medieval city that emerged from successful siege recovery was rarely identical to its predecessor, having been forged anew through fire, hunger, and shared determination to endure.